Thanks for staying with us on DD India, India's Voice to the World. I'm Sakal Bhatt and you're watching this special broadcast. Prime Minister Modi at G20 Summit in Rio in Brazil. Well, it's day 2 of Rio Summit and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is expected to speak in a session titled Sustainable Development and Energy Transition. The session reportedly which is currently underway. We will keep an eye on the developments at the Rio Summit and also the larger picture, the big picture when it comes to the concluding day of the summit level talks at G20, at BRICS and much more. So let's begin. World leaders have convened on the margins of the G20 Leaders Summit in Rio on the day 2. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, head of the states of Singapore, Portugal, Norway, Spain, Mexico, along with multilateral agencies like WHO, United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund and WTO took part in the session. The leaders emphasized the power of digital public infrastructure, artificial intelligence and data-driven governance in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and also transforming lives of people globally. Brazil's president urged leaders of the group of 20 major economies at a summit to increase their targets for cutting greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Tuesday met Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva during the G20 summit in Rio and took stock of the full range of bilateral ties while reaffirming India's commitment to improving cooperation in sectors like energy, biofuels, defense and agriculture. Prime Minister Modi complimented President Lula on various efforts of Brazil during their G20 presidency. The Brazilian president also told Prime Minister Modi that they have incorporated several things in their G20 which were inspired from India's presidency. President Lula added that Brazil wanted to reach the level of efficiency in organizing the summit that India had shown last year. Brazil is hosting the 19th G20 summit. India is part of the G20 Troika along with Brazil and South Africa. Prime Minister Modi also held talks with Chilean President Gabriel Boric on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Both the leaders held discussions in areas of mutual interest, among other important things. Prime Minister Modi also held bilaterals with President of Argentina, Javier Milei, on the sidelines of the summit. Leaders of the group of 20 major economies are converging in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil today to discuss sustainable development and the transition to cleaner energy as they aim to increase the odds of the successful deal to address global warming at UN. Climate talks in Azerbaijan are underway. Meanwhile, on day 1 of the summit, a joint declaration was adopted which addressed a range of issues of global importance. DD India's Mihir Maikuri has more.
As the world faces unprecedented crises, leaders from the group of 20 major economies are meeting in Brazil to address these challenges and chart a way forward. On day 2 of the G20 summit, focus is on sustainable development and the transition to cleaner energy, aiming to bolster the chances of a successful deal at the United Nations climate talks in Azerbaijan. In a joint statement, G20 leaders reaffirmed their commitment to climate action and emphasized the urgent need for negotiators at COP29 to agree on a new financial goal. This goal will outline the contributions wealthy nations must take to support developing countries in combating climate change. COP29 has welcomed this commitment.
Friends, the G20 has now issued its leaders' communique, and we are grateful for the support they have pledged for the COP29 presidency. We appreciate the signal that they have sent of their intention to accelerate the reform of the international financial architecture. We thank them for their support for a successful NCQG outcome in Baku. We now need to translate political will into practical work.
On the conflict in Ukraine, G20 leaders reached a narrow consensus. focusing on the human suffering and economic fallout of the conflict. The leaders also expressed deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza, calling for increased aid, civilian protection, and a comprehensive ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon. The G20 endorsed a proposal to ensure that ultra-high net worth individuals are effectively taxed, a key victory for Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. On day one of the G20 summit, President Lula launched a global alliance to combat poverty and hunger backed by 81 countries.
It is up to those who are here. It is up to those around this table, the unavoidable task of ending this scourge that shames humanity. That's why we set as the central objective of the Brazilian presidency in the G20 the launch of a global alliance against hunger and poverty. This will be our greatest legacy.
US President Joe Biden pledged $4 billion to the World Bank's International Development Association to support the world's poorest nations.
I'm proud to announce the United States is pledging $4 billion over the next 3 years to the World Bank's International Development Association.
As the G20 summit continues, the world watches closely. With urgent global challenges at the forefront, from climate change and poverty to conflict and inequality, leaders are faced with the difficult task of turning words into action. Mihir Makhuri reporting for DD India.
And we're very glad to be joined by our special guest on this special broadcast, Ambassador J.S. Mukul. He has been the former India envoy to Oman and the Netherlands, and although India's Deputy Sherpa for the 6th G20 Summit, joining us live on this broadcast. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us. Such a pleasure talking to you. Also welcoming Professor Umu Salma Bawa from School of International Studies, JNU. Always a pleasure talking to you, ma'am. Ambassador, sir, I'd like to start with you. How do you see India playing a key role in terms of not only shaping the current agenda of the BRICS summit, now today is the day 2 and the concluding day, but also building on the legacy of Delhi summit, considering the interventions that the Honorable Prime Minister made yesterday. And today we are also expecting, it's expected Prime Minister as we speak. The session is currently underway. In all likelihood, he is going to be speaking in the Sustainable Development Energy Transition session as well. But so far, so good. What do you make of India at BRICS 20, at G20?
Thank you very much. No, I think the Indian contribution is very clear. We are, apart from the fact that we are part of the G20 Troika, the New Delhi Declaration finds a resonance in various important aspects of the Rio Summit. The communique which was put out yesterday showed that all the 3 major priorities of the Brazilian presidency, starting with the fight against the social inclusion and fight against poverty and hunger, that all has resonance with the Delhi Declaration. It echoes the food security aspect and the Deccan high-level principles on food security and nutrition, which were endorsed at the New Delhi Summit. Similarly, the second priority with regard to global governance, both in the multilateral development bank sector, or generally with regard to all other institutions, also find resonance in the communique and in the deliberations. And today, as you mentioned, the third Brazilian priority of sustainable development, energy transitions and climate change. I'm sure
we are closing on a series of elections. 2024 was seen as an election year. There's both continuity and change, both at the political level, at the economic level, and more importantly, at the level of where people stand as the year closes, looking forward to the next year starting at 2025. So it's very interesting, as we speak, there is the G20 happening in Brazil. At the same time, the COP taking place in Azerbaijan. Finance and environment, 2 very critical things to every action whichever part of the world we are located in. And I think you're looking at a collective political leadership where, I mean, the G20, presents in terms of the collective economic power, but at the same time, where the planet stands today, what we need to do collectively and of course individually in reaching targets, which is coming out of Azerbaijan, drawing attention to, why these conversations assume so much of importance. When you go through the summit statement which has come out and been put out by Brazil, there are two things to it. There's a long line of intentionalities which have been reiterated, and that shows the continuity where the G20 has moved to the global south. India last year, or Indonesia the year before, India, now in Brazil, and next year in South Africa. So I think that resonance of the anxieties of the South do get reflected in the document. At the same time, I think what is also important to notice, these are aspirational. It talks about how collective action can be done. We also need to see in terms of timelines, and perhaps that is where individual countries will need to, once the dust of the summit settles down, start, trying to see how you take it forward. But at this point, the fact that the world is coming together to take a step forward is extremely important.
So climate finances, that's something Ambassador Mukul, as ma'am pointed out, dominated the discourse at Baku. Now, there have been conversations at the G20 also about climate. Do you see these conversations in a way impacting each other? Resonance?
Most certainly. In fact, the G20 is an informal forum which sends important political messages and impulses to various organizations. And in this case, I think the G20 message has not only been sent, but as I was listening, I think it has already been received in Baku. And we hope that this political impulse will lead to further progress, because finances and resources are the key factor which remain to be implemented. I think we heard it say that the political will has been clearly expressed. What is required is actual practical implementation. And we would like to see that reflected in the outcome of Baku by the end of this week.
Another important aspect that has been, that in fact has figured prominently in the declaration, Professor Uma, this is about, Professor Umu, I beg your pardon, the Russia-Ukraine. The conflict must stop. But then the ground realities are different. And as we speak, that has been picked up at the Warsaw Summit also. And the onslaught continues, where Russia has in the recent, Russia's claimed that the recent missiles that Ukraine has launched are US made. So you're talking about the war to end, the Russia-Ukraine at the summit, but nothing is moving on ground.
I think, it's a very hard reality that, war doesn't end overnight until something dramatic happens. So what you're seeing is two things. I think what we see at the political level is a call to recognize that there's this huge humanitarian crisis which both the wars have produced, both in Ukraine and in Gaza. And I think there's a call for that, to recognize that this cannot go on endlessly. At the same time, recognizing that all efforts towards finding a solution has to take place. Now, clearly, as we stand at this point, the American elections are done and dusted. There is a new administration which will be coming in January. So clearly, there is an indication that a lot more is going to come on the table. But at this point, I think what you see is that we did get a document in which all the leaders signed off. I think that is important. The ability to see that, to recognize that yes, conflict is there, and the ability to recognize that there needs to be a way forward. I think that is important to emphasize.
Okay.
How it will happen, I think that is going to be something for a different platform.
Just to get the context as to what is really happening there as we speak, let's go live to our colleague, senior colleague joining us live all the way from Media Center in Rio de Janeiro. Gautam, we were just talking, we have Ambassador Mukul and Professor Baba with us on the show, that, two important discussions of the global concerns that have dominated the discourse at Summit 3 is one on climate finances, the conversations revolving around climate finances, and Russia-Ukraine war must stop. But the ground realities are different. So how is this panning out there? Just give us a context and also a bit on what is expected on the concluding day. Gautam, over to you.
Mr. Hi, good evening to you there in Delhi. It's of course almost midday here in Rio. And if you talk about how the conversation has been going on climate finance and the overall response to climate change, in Rio, generally such a direction came yesterday itself when we talked about, we had Prime Minister Modi talking about how it needs to be something that will create very, very clearly to everyone. And that was reflected in the DA declaration as well, where a large part of the 85-page statement, the declaration, was devoted to the issue of climate change and sustainable development. And there you have seen how there is a talk of graduating from talking about billions to trillions for climate finance. And even in today's session of sustainable development and energy transition, President Gita was very clear that it's the developing world which needs to be more ambitious in terms of responding to how climate change is affecting all of us already with all these extreme weather events taking place. Just a few months back, a huge fire in Brazil itself. And we've faced that problem in India too, with floods as well as we've had forest fires as well, apart from other issues happening with climate change. So the response of the developed world needs to be even more advanced. He said that at least for 5 years, the target should be advanced. That is, if a country said it will be climate neutral or net zero by 2040, it should be 2035. If it's 2050, it should be 2045. As India at Baku in Azerbaijan with the COP29 president he said that this will help India, a nation which is still developing, to have some sort of a carbon space, because that is what India needs, and India has not a legacy polluter. And it's the US, the countries like the US, which are legacy polluters. It is now the second largest emitter of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the world. China has taken the number one spot, but as a legacy emitter, it's still number one. So these are the countries who should create that space, and at the same time, again, President Lula, in this session today, this taking place is very clearly said that all the other targets, be it related to finance, be it related to afforestation, he said that we will be having zero deforestation by 2030. That's the target that he's announced for Brazil. So everybody needs to be more ambitious on these fronts.
Okay, tell us more, a sort of insight as far as President Lula da Silva's meeting with our Prime Minister Modi, the bilateral that happened today, and the conversations that transpired between the two leaders.
Yes, it was a very warm meeting, very warm fun all around, and President Lula himself said that he wants to visit India next year, and Prime Minister Modi said that he'll try and make arrangements for a state visit. President Lula also praised the way India conducted the G20 Summit last year, saying that a lot of things that Brazil had in its agenda and the way it carried out everything throughout the year was influenced by India. And he said that he was trying to sort of get to the level of success that India achieved in organizing the G20 Summit, and how even the Delhi declaration was announced on the first day itself. The Rio declaration also came out on day one, slightly later today. But it seems like India has set a very interesting precedent for President Lula to follow. He's trying his best to do that.
Okay, and what about the other important bilaterals that happened yesterday and today, Gautam? An overview of that, since it's the concluding day today, just to have an understanding how it panned out as far as for India on the sidelines of the summit.
Well, we've already had bilateral stages today itself. We've had the one with Brazil, as you mentioned, we had talked about it. We had bilaterals with Argentina, Argentina, and right now we've had one with Chile as well. President Boric and had a bilateral with Prime Minister Modi. I believe at least one more bilateral is on the annual. Apart from that, Prime Minister Modi also met a whole range of leaders on the subject of leveraging digital threats, issues like DPI, where the UN Secretary General was also present. About the leaders, Ajay Danga from the World Bank was there. So that is something, again, and engagement that India has carried out, because India wants to talk about it and the benefits of it in terms of how it can help in eliminating hunger and poverty, and apart from addressing other ills in society as well.
Okay. Finally, Gautam, what really in these 2 days, though, you said that it's afternoon and I'm sure there are some more important engagements that are left, but what all does India really bring to the table, or perhaps India's presence, India's balance, India's experience that it brought to the table, G20 at BRICS, and for Brazil to continue India's legacy? Basically, what made India's presence under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi special at the summit?
But India has had an impression on how the world engages with itself. India has created that space for itself, where the world wants to engage with India. And we've seen that happening here as well over the course of 2 days. By the time Prime Minister Modi is back on the plane, not back in the plane to India, but before that he has another bilateral visit to Undertake, that's in Guyana. But in the course of the 2 days that he's been in Rio, there would have been at least, a total of 10 bilateral engagements, and these are proper sit-downs with teams on either side of the table, engagement rooms that are there at the venue of the man. Apart from that, he's run into so many other world meetings as well through the course of these 2 days, and each has been a worthwhile exchange. So India has been a major influence on multilateralism that has led to a lot of space being created, although if you talk about that being reflected in how the world is governed in terms of global institutions, there's still a long way to go in the reforms process, which is also one of the sessions here in Rio. And that is the needle that countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, which is the Troika this time around, trying to move. South Africa will, of course, in a short while from now, also in a symbolic manner, be handed over the presidency for next year as well, although the transition only happens in December from Brazil to South Africa. But there will be a moment here that will be indicative of that change as well.
Okay, many thanks, Gautam, for joining us live from Media Center in Rio. We will come to you in a bit. Thank you very much as of now for joining from Rio. Thank you. Ambassador Mukul and Professor Baba continues to be with us. Can we go back to our guests? Ambassador Mukul, I'm sure you heard my colleague Gautam giving us a perspective from Rio itself. So talking about India at G20, the fact that how we managed to make the G20 summitary level talk more people-centric and not really talk shop, and it has been sort of incumbent on Brazil to take the legacy forward in terms of continuity and also in terms of India shaping the broader contours of this year's this year's G20 summit agenda. Ambassador Mukul, and then ma'am can talk on that as well.
Well, thank you. First of all, just to touch on the very clear, comprehensive and substantive communique that has come out of Rio. There were a lot of skeptics who have been proved wrong, who are raising doubts, given that the geopolitical situation had become fraught, including very recently with the missiles, etc., being referred to in the Ukraine. But I think it is to the credit of the G20 members and, of course, the Troika, and again, of course, the Brazilian presidency, that they have crafted a comprehensive 85-paragraph, very substantive document, which in a way very well nuances and finesses both the ongoing problems or conflicts that are happening in West Asia and in the Ukraine.
Ukraine, right.
It starts by referring to the economy. We hope of the global economy will have a soft landing, but thereon goes on to say that there are downside risks because of these conflicts, and refers back to the UN Charter principles to say that focusing on the humanitarian side and making it very clear that a ceasefire is immediately required in West Asia, on the Gaza, as well as in Lebanon. On the Ukraine also, it goes on to say that this has been disruptive of the global economy, is disruptive of the food security, the energy security, the supply chains, causes inflation, harms growth, etc. And thereby also then refers back to the UN Charter principles. So I think it's very, very well crafted in order to get a compromise on all sides, as I said, proving some of the skeptics wrong who had raised doubts.
Okay, that's a very good point, sir, that you've raised. In fact, if you could also share some perspective or insights. You've yourself been a Deputy Sherpa in one of the earlier editions of the G20 Summit. So if you could just give us an understanding, how does this really work out in the context of, current geopolitics, you yourself mentioned. And also, one cannot really ignore the fact, the kind of stability that Prime Minister of India really brings to the table. This has been globally an election year for many of those G20 members, a tumultuous year for many of them financially, beleaguered economy, and they had their own domestic issues. And here you have Prime Minister of India, third consecutive term, and talking about the priorities of the Global South, emerging leader of the Global South.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that is now a given, that the stature, standing, and the esteem in which the Honorable Prime Minister is held plays a major role. With regard to the Sherpas that you asked, this is a process which takes place. It's a very intense process, and usually the contentious issues go right down to the wire. As I guess it happened, the communique was put out late evening in Rio, or early hours of the morning in India. So I think it's really went down to the almost to the wire. Okay. And I think, as I said, it was very well crafted in terms of finessing the different positions in order to get a consensus.
Professor Bawa, so G20 grouping, multilateral agencies, and the inclusion of European Union and African Union, they all taking their slated positions that the war wherever in the world must end. There has to be a consensus on the climate financing. All that is part of the declaration, but then translating that into action. So that's yes.
As they say, always the devil lies in the details. But I think, as the ambassador just said, I think one has to also start with the summit document which has been put out. The fact that a document for the second year in a row, despite the kind of conflict that we see, has been put together, shows at one level first a political commitment to move forward. I think that is something which has to be emphasized. Because, the fact that all the parties agreed to the wording, and that's where it is, it's a little bit of give and take, not only politically, but also with the intention that we are moving towards a new agenda setting. I think that's extremely important. Second, like I said, when, the 20 leaders, the 20 in the terms of the two unions, African Union is there for the first time, the European Union is there, and 19 countries. I mean, we are looking at 2/3 of the global population sitting around that table, being represented in the kind of political will which wants to address critical issues which impact everybody. In that sense, what India set, as the slogan for its G20 summit of the earth, the family, and the future all being one, is being reiterated again over there. So you can clearly see that message going through, that, we're all in this together. The impact on it on countries obviously is going to be very differentiated, located where they are. But the world cannot continue, when two major conflicts are on, and we are looking at a future in which our environment is getting degraded every day. So financing is extremely important. The document does talk about financing. It talks about also about how, extremely rich can pay more, but it leaves the details out. And I think that's where President Biden's commitment of more to the IMF is a welcome signal. But as was said also in the report earlier, I think it's a very clear political signal which has been sent from here in Brazil to Azerbaijan to the COP29 that we are together. So now, I think ultimately when we're looking at what can be done for the environment, what can be done at the level, that comes down to an individual country level. And I think that's what India's commitment stands firm. As the world's largest population, I think the Prime Minister's message is very clear. We are taking our people forward, but including everybody. It's about that. The slogan of India is about taking everybody in this journey together.
Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Right.
Correct.
In fact, since we are, discussing the nitty-gritties of declaration, Ambassador Mukul and Professor Bawa, let's, for the benefit of our viewers, talk about the operatives of, or the operative portions of the summit declaration earlier. And I would request both of you to please stay with us, because we are going to play these graphics for our viewers, because the summit of the group of 20 leading economies in Brazil issued the G20 Rio de Janeiro leaders declaration. And this declaration addressed major global challenges and crises. It prioritized actions towards achieving concrete results in the fight against hunger and poverty, and also emphasizing the launch of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. The declaration was issued on Monday, and it underlined the setback the fight against hunger and poverty suffered due to COVID-19, and called for a greater and more effective commitment to fight the twin evils. As per the leaders' declaration, the leaders underscored the G20 commitment to the importance of food security and nutrition, and of the progressive realization of the right to adequate food, as reaffirmed through the Deccan High-Level Principles. The G20 group also launched the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. The leaders called for speedy implementation of the G20 2023 Action Plan on accelerating progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. The leaders expressed deep concern about humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the escalation in Lebanon. While talking about the war in Ukraine, the leaders highlighted human suffering and negative added impacts of the war with regard to global food and energy security, supply chains, macro-financial stability, inflation and growth. The leaders condemned terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, while they committed or recommitted to the advancing the goal of world free of nuclear weapons and a safer place for all, and will uphold obligations in this regard. Ambassador Mukul, well, a bit more about the declaration and the more actionable points, the mention of the nuclear-free world. Does it surprise you?
No, I think that's a fairly standard formulation which is there, and it finds resonance in repeatedly in the summit level declarations. But for me, what struck me as very significant was the reference to ultra high net worth individuals being brought under the tax net. Now, that is a Brazilian initiative, a Brazilian proposal, which was being opposed, as I understand, by the G7 or the developed countries in general. Maybe there is a compromise there, so the details have not been spelled out in the joint communique in terms of the quantitative side of it. But I think G20 as it works has a Christmas tree approach, and the fact that this particular concept has got embedded by consensus in the joint communique coming out of the summit, leaders communique coming from the summit, I think is very significant, because it will now develop a life of its own and a momentum of its own going forward. Now, this is important because obviously there is a need to tap some of the ultra rich or the super rich. Ultra high net worth is the term used in the communique in terms of mobilizing resources, both for SDGs implementation by that's the Sustainable Development Goals being implemented by the target date of 2030. And we all know that the SDG is lagging behind. In fact, one report says there are only 17% implementation as of date, with just 6 years to go. So that, I think, is very significant from my perspective, and I think it will gain traction. There is also a reference there to preventing tax evasion and avoidance, and that way the leaders have called upon the inclusive framework of the BEPS, the base erosion and profit sharing, to encouraging them to take this forward. So as I said, even if it is in general terms, as a concept, that getting into the communique is fairly significant. So
Professor Bawa, yes sir. Professor Bawa, your thoughts? High
Well,
points of the declaration.
I think, as Ambassador just pointed out, there will always be the local flair where, in terms of the country which is leading the presidency. And you can see the personal imprint of President Lula's own background, in two of these key things. One was on taxation, and the other is on this alliance against, hunger and poverty. I think it also points to the fact that in a time of 2024, when the kind of amount of food production which is taking place, to not be able to feed everybody when there is an abundance of food draws also to the mismanagement and waste, and also the fact that something like this should not exist in this era and time. That a child will sleep on an empty stomach is something which should be, it has to be a fight, which has to be a global fight. Everybody has to join. Hunger and malnutrition is visible, and hunger also exists in the developed world. So it's something which requires a consensus of all, and I think that is a personal milestone for the Brazilian president in terms of getting that in. It's also important to note that at a time of crisis, the emphasis, if you look at the document, on the reform of the global governance institutions.
Yes.
I see that as something which is, again, like I point out, a call for collective action and political intentionality. But of course, we have to keep in mind that that work is not going to get done over here. It has to happen in the United Nations. But as an informal body which brings the amount of convening power around the table, it's an important point to flag over here that there is an understanding within the group that the institutions of global governance, or as we talk about multilateralism, is not keeping pace with the kind of changes, the kind of challenges which are coming.
Yes, ma'am, you know that point that you raised now, but can the current structure of G20 grouping actually kind of push the whole narrative of reforms? We've been talking about these reforms, I don't know, I mean, it's been, you would know, ma'am, like decades. It's been decades now. But G20 grouping has only moved from strength to strength. And now you have European Union part of it. You have African Union part of it, thanks to India. The nations representing 85% of the global GDP, 75% of the world trade, 2/3 of the world population is what the G20 plus others really represent, and perhaps more. So now it's time to not just talk shop about reforms, but do it.
I think reforms, there's two sides to it. In one way, the old existing order is, I wouldn't say gone away, but there is definitely a disaggregation of power happening within the structure at a larger level. But when power changes, it is not like a baton race, like somebody at a relay race will hand over the baton to somebody else. There will always be resistance, and there will always be resistance to change. At the same time, those who seek change will also come forward with their own ideas. And I think that's what you see playing out at various fora. And as India grows from strength to strength, with our economic, footprint growing, India will also, bring more to the table in terms of what it can do in terms of its own capability and capacities. And there's no ignoring the fact that at some point, all these collective actions will reach a tipping point where reform will take place. I don't think anybody can do a crystal gazing at this point in time and give us a date. But I think what we should see is that the fact that even an informal grouping like a G20 can come together and put out, a statement on intentionality is the first starting point. I think that means it shows that between the different countries around the table, there is some kind of building of an idea that reform is essential going ahead. It cannot continue like that.
Interesting.
Yes. That is a point which one should emphasize.
Okay. I think Ambassador Mukul, the aspect of intentionality, as ma'am puts in, do you see that being reflected in this summit?
No, absolutely. I would call it political will and reflection, and sending a political impetus or a political message. That is very much there. And talking of the reform of the global governance institutions, I think this communique has gone much beyond the earlier ones of the G20 in terms of spelling out in so much detail. For example, there's a full section on UN where they talk of the reform of the General Assembly, the reform of the Security Council, separately of the ECOSOC, linking it with the SDGs realization, the Peace Building Commission, the UN Secretariat, and also not forgetting that positions like the Secretary General and other senior positions in the Secretariat should also be given in a balanced manner and including to women. I think that is very important. Then they go to the international financial architecture where they refer to the better, bigger and stronger MDBs, the multilateral development banks. And here let me say that the Brazilian presidency has done well in inviting a large number of multilateral development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank, the Development Bank of Latin America, etc., and even the BRICS Bank, the new development bank.
Right.
And it goes on to World Bank, IMF, and the multilateral trading system in terms of the WTO.
Okay.
And interestingly, talks of the realization, full, real and effective realization of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism in 2024.
Okay.
Now that's interesting because the earlier Trump administration, the first tenure, was responsible for disrupting the DSM. So they are trying, if that is the intention, because we are already in middle of November, and to talk of this being settled in 2024, are they trying to preempt the appointment of these appellate panel judges? I think that is also very significant. If I can just take a minute and come.
Sir, with your permission, sir, I would just, because we're getting some important news coming in from Rio, and that is going to be our next talking point. But I'm going to come to you and you can finish your point and then we move on. Let's take a look at Professor Bawa. We're getting some good news from Rio now. India's Prime Minister, as we were just discussing with the panelists also, today participated in the third session of the G20 Brazil Summit on Sustainable Development and Energy Transition in Rio. Prime Minister underlined the importance of accelerating efforts to ensure a cleaner, more sustainable future for all, including through mainstreaming Varanasi principles on life and initiatives such as International Solar Alliance, One World, One Sun, One Grid, and the Global Biofuel Alliance. Prime Minister said that Varanasi Action Plan will accelerate achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals. He added that under Brazil's presidency, priority is accorded to implementing these goals. Prime Minister Modi mentioned that over last one decade, more than homes for 40 million were built, and in over last 5 years, clean water supply was ensured for 120 million homes in India. Prime Minister also added that efforts are based on traditional Indian thought, which is progressive and balanced. While he added that India is first country to fulfill the commitments under Paris Agreement, India made green transition, people's movement, and over 10 million families registered for solar rooftop program. Also, Prime Minister added that India is sharing successful experiences with friendly countries, particularly Global South. And also, we can tell our viewers that as we speak, Brazil has handed over the baton of G20 presidency to South Africa. And let's quickly go back to our guests and talk about the interventions or the address by Honorable Prime Minister of India in the session titled Energy Transition and Sustainable Development. It's very heartening to see Varanasi figuring out at G20. So we begin with that. And we can play those graphics again. Ambassador Mukul.
No, absolutely. I mean, as I said earlier, it was the Deccan Principles on the food side, hunger and poverty. Now it is the Varanasi Principles coming in terms of the energy transition, etc. So obviously these are very important, and I think the Prime Minister, I heard you say, and we read in the graphics, linked it to the realization of the SDGs.
Yes.
And again, the alliance against poverty and hunger really goes to the heart of the first two SDGs. SDG 1, as we know, talks of no poverty, and SDG 2 talks of zero hunger. So I think it's all coming together very well in terms of there are linkages with regard to all these priorities, and I think it is in that context that the Honorable Prime Minister mentioned not only India's achievements and particularly the fact that we are one of the only large developing country or large country which is actually meeting and in some ways exceeding our Paris targets, whereas others seem to be lagging behind.
Yes, I'm going to go through these points one by one, Ambassador, and then we can talk about it. Now, specifically talking about the first point, Varanasi Principles on Life. That's the LIFE initiative he meant, and initiatives such as International Solar Alliance, One World, One Sun, One Grid, and the Global Biofuel Alliance. Yes, sir.
No, absolutely. I mean, all these are very much part of also their fine reflection in the Rio communique. In fact, the LIFE is referred to, the initiative that was taken at the Delhi summit. We called it LIFE for Environment, LIFE, abbreviated as that. The Varanasi Principles have of course been there. They are part of the documentation and so on and so forth. So all of these, and the biofuels, one of the major outcomes of the Delhi summit was the BPA, the biofuel global GBA, the Global Biofuels Alliance, and that I think is again reflected in terms of our Prime Minister's intervention at this last formal official session.
Engagement, yes. Professor Bawa, specific mention of in the last one decade, you know, our Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, our inclusive development paradigm. Honorable Prime Minister talking about how India has provided homes for 40 million, and that's in a decade. And in 5 years, clean water supply ensured for 120 million homes.
So, I mean, India is becoming a role model at how it can provide for its own people. I think the idea that, you have to put out a hand and you will receive something to do, India has moved on from that to a point where India is meeting the needs of its own people internally. And also in a way that is sustainable, that is green. We're talking of energy transition, so just and also bringing people into the everyday activity in the sense of, look at our digital public infrastructure, what we have been able to achieve with that in terms of linking people, in the sense of the ease of doing business, but at the level of a human. And so I think what the Prime Minister has emphasized and what India has shown is the human-centric approach, which has been so essential to what we have done and achieved in India in the last 10 years. Ultimately, all our SDGs, which we are talking about, and we are, the time is running away. What the pandemic has done and what conflict does to produce is to escalate the cost, and the inability to meet targets would mean that it's not just one or two countries, but globally, everybody has signed up to the SDGs. And collectively, we will all have to deliver because the cost of non-delivery would be huge. I think in that context, given the size of India's population, the scale of transformation which is demanded, and the ability to meet that challenge substantially from within, emphasizes the kind of delivery systems that we have developed over here, and which could really become, a model for many of the countries in the global south.
Right.
So I think it's also heartening to see what has been taken forward from New Delhi in our G20 agenda, putting the one world, one earth, and the people together, again in Brazil.
Ambassador Mukul, there's also a mention of switch to green transition energy, making it a people's movement. India proudly talking about green switch or green transition, where over 10 million families have been registered in India for the solar rooftop program.
No, again, we have a very good record, as I say, since the Paris Agreement on most of these areas. Our initiatives like the International Solar Alliance, which resonates with the rooftop solar lighting, and also the other initiative of the Coalition for Disaster Resistance Infrastructure, the CDRI. I think these are well acknowledged in the world. And today we also heard the other priority of the DPI, the Digital Public Infrastructure, and a special meeting that was held there in Rio, reflecting the importance of all these. So yes, we are demanders in this. we are actively and proactively involved. But obviously, there is some gap between the political will and its actual reflection and implementation on the ground. And finance, technology, and for mitigation and adaptation needs remains a major demand of not just India, but of the global South and the developing world as a whole.
You know, the Global South also finds a specific mention in Prime Minister's intervention. Ambassador Mukul, your comments. Prime Minister's categorically stating that India is sharing these successful experiences with friendly countries, in particularly Global South. So this whole conversation about India prioritizing the concerns, the needs, the anxieties, as ma'am put in earlier, about of Global South, it's not just verbally but part of our communique.
Yeah, it's part of our communique. It goes back to the Voice of the Global South Summit, which Prime Minister hosted at the beginning of our presidency, and then a second Voice of the Global South Summit at the end, towards just after the end of our presidency, to brief them. And even in mid-2024, a third Global South Summit in terms. So I think we have been engaged with the Global South at all levels. And I must also say that Brazil has done its bit in this regard by hosting the social summit, the G20 social summit, which brings in, apart from the governments, it also brings in the civil society and the NGOs. Similarly, there are a number of other small things which the Brazilians did, which I think it would be useful to recall some of their initiatives, particularly the one about the Sherpas and the finance tracks meeting in terms of the two task forces that they have put up. Then there is, of course, the Brazilian presidency for the first time in New York at the foreign ministers level, invited all the countries of the UN, all the UN members to join in. So I think that was their initiative. And I mentioned the social summit. And now, of course, as we heard from your correspondent in Rio, the baton has been handed over just now from Brazil to South Africa. I think this again augurs well for Global South as a whole.
Correct.
Fourth consecutive term that we will be having, as Professor Baba had mentioned. But also, I think the South African presidency is important as it completes the first cycle of G20 summits. With South Africa next year, 2025, every G20 country would have hosted a summit, and we would then be starting a new cycle with the United States in 2026. And the importance of G20 can be seen with the fact that I think, and the communique reflects this, that Saudi Arabia has already thrown its hat in the ring to advance its presidency, perhaps in 2027 and so forth. So I think that again attests to the importance.
So I'll just interrupt you here for a moment. That's the G20 family or group photo or photo op with Prime Minister of India along with the other G20 heads of the state holding hands in solidarity. Prime Minister Modi flanked by Lula da Silva, Brazilian president on one side, and outgoing President of United States of America, Joe Biden, on the other side. This year's theme being building a just world and sustainable planet, with 3 priority areas where India also played a very, very stellar role in setting the agenda of this year's G20 summit, concluding day today, perhaps the concluding moments we can say in Rio de Janeiro. 3 priority areas, including social inclusion and the fight against hunger, where Prime Minister of India made some very, very pertinent points representing India on day 1. The second priority area, reforming global governance institutions, and the third priority area, strengthening sustainable development. On your screens from Rio, group of G20 nations, heads of the state, holding hands in solidarity as Brazil hands over the baton to the next G20 host, that is South Africa. And as we stay with these visuals, we can have our panelists making concluding remarks. So, summing up the summit and India at G20 in Brazil, Professor Bava.
So I think as the baton has changed hands, the summit has moved further to the south. The voice of the south will resonate one more time, and I think that's important to emphasize as transitions take place in other cities. As Ambassador Mukul pointed out, it will go back to America 1 year later. But very importantly, I think on the global south, as India, stepped forward and put thought and action into intentionality about inviting the G20 countries, we also saw China stepping forward also to offer its own within the G20 and also to the global south. So I think we see very interesting phenomena of how the issue of the global south will reverberate now as it moves on to South Africa.
Okay.
But I think as the Troika continues, some of the ideas of New Delhi will now move to Africa.
Yeah. India not only shaping the agenda but pushing the agenda as well quite constructively under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. Ambassador Mukul, final remarks.
Well, I think a very successful summit with very substantive outcomes which will resonate across various domains going forward. So that is about the summit. With regard to India, of course, both in terms of our Troika participation as also the legacy issues which were taken up from the New Delhi declaration and the summit in our presidency and our summit, I think it was satisfying for us to see the outcomes.
All right. We leave it there. Such a pleasure talking to you, Ambassador J.S. Mukul. You've been the former envoy of India to Oman and Netherlands, and also sharing your insights and real-time experiences as a Deputy Sherpa on the show. Thank you very much, Deputy Sherpa of the 6th G20 Summit. Thank you, sir. And such a pleasure talking to you as well, Professor Bava. With that, that's all for this special broadcast, India at G20 Rio Summit in Brazil. We'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. On the other side, my colleague Shubhendu will join you with more news and updates. Please don't go away. Stay with us on DD India.